Mount Dundas, South Glengarry.
Mr. Speaker, today Canadians are awaiting the vote on our Conservative motion calling for a plan and timeline to end all federal mandates and restrictions in Canada. For over 2 years, Canadians have done what is asked of them. They followed the rules. They did what it took to get us to a point where we can finally see the end of this pandemic. Other similar countries around the world have given hope and provided leadership by releasing their plans. Canada is one of the most vaccinated countries in the entire world, and that should be celebrated. And we should be celebrating where the science and data by medical experts is headed. Instead, our country has never been more divided, angry, and pessimistic. The Prime Minister created this mess by his tone and unacceptable language when attacking those who disagree with him. So today, Parliament has a choice: to provide hope and optimism with a clear plan and timeline to end federal mandates, or to plunge us into further chaos and division in a time where the opposite is needed. The country is watching. Mr. Speaker, will the Liberals join us and answer the call for a plan today?
The Prime Minister is planning to invoke the Emergencies Act to deal with the current protests in Ottawa and in some parts of the country. We know the protests continue here in Ottawa. We know the Windsor border has been reopened. We know that last night there have been arrests in Coutts. Section 16 of the Emergency Act refers to threats to the security of Canada. Given this context, does the Prime Minister think that these protests constitute a threat to the security of Canada? And if not, does he think that with this news he could be escalating rather than de-escalating an already inflamed situation? We've been asking the Prime Minister to stop dividing, stigmatizing, and name-calling people he disagrees with. Let them know that he listens and that he hears them, but he refuses to do that. Today we are voting on a Conservative motion, a reasonable motion that asks the government to present a plan for a reopening by the end of the month. This should be a time of optimism and joy for Canadians, not division and fear. Can Canadians count on the Prime Minister to do the right thing and today stand up with us, support our motion, and give Canadians the hope that they deserve so much? It's clear the Prime Minister and these Liberals are still big fans of polarization, division, and negativity. 2 years into this pandemic, Mr. Speaker, Canadians deserve, in this moment, some optimism and some hope for the future, and they deserve it leadership from their government. They need to know when the federal mandates and restrictions will be lifted. That is not an unreasonable ask. So again, will the Liberals, will their Prime Minister, will their ministers, will the backbenchers stand up for their constituents, vote with us to present some optimism and some hope for Canadians?
The Honourable Member for Mégantic-L'Érable. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Canadians won't be fooled. They understand the political games of the Prime Minister. First, he voluntarily chose, well, according to his own members, people from his team are saying this, to politicize and to devise and stigmatize to win an election. Then he chose to politicize the pandemic, and that's what he's still doing today. Mr. Speaker, Section 15 on the Emergencies Act, in terms of Canada's security, could be adopted. How can the Prime Minister justify the recourse of emergency measures? The Honourable Minister. The Honourable Member for Mégantic-L'Érable. Mr. Speaker, the situation is unfolding today, and it could have been avoided. The Prime Minister divided Canadians during his campaign, and his caucus is now divided. And he continued to hide for days instead of reducing tensions. People want things to be resolved peacefully. We don't want to see the army in the streets. Will the Prime Minister vote in favour of our motion and present to all Canadians a plan like all other governments have done? Thank you. The Honourable Member for La Prairie. The Prime Minister intends to invoke the Emergencies Act to deal with the occupation of Ottawa. He'll have 7 days to get the extraordinary powers he wants to be ratified by the House. But he refuses to say exactly how he intends to use these powers, yet the public has a right to know. We cannot wait for the content of the plan to drag on for 7 days. We're not going to give them a blank check when we're talking about extreme powers, including the use of the army. Will the Prime Minister reveal his detailed plan today? Doing nothing for 3 weeks. There are some things we do know, but we don't know what the Prime Minister's plan is. We know that Quebec is opposed to seeing the Emergencies Act imposed. We know that the crisis in Quebec has been much better managed than elsewhere in Canada. If the Premier of Ontario wishes to see emergency measures in his province, that's his choice. But does the government commit to not imposing the Emergencies Act in Quebec?
Where was this Prime Minister 18 days ago when this started? If he'd showed leadership and acted promptly, we wouldn't have to talk about emergency measures today. Canadians want to know why the Prime Minister let things get so bad. Why is it taking him so long to show any leadership at all?
Honourable Member for Rosemont, La Petite Patrie. Mr. Speaker, the reality is that this Prime Minister was absent since the beginning of the convoy crisis, and that's nothing new. He's been absent from the housing crisis, absent with the rising cost of living, absent in the face of the climate crisis, and on health transfers. Today, people feel left behind, abandoned. They want a Prime Minister who won't wait for the worst to happen before taking action. Why is this Prime Minister refusing to act when people really need help? Honourable Member for Bellechasse. Thank you. My riding has seen member people talk about the lack of leadership in this current government. Canadians who are vaccinated, well, they represent 90% of the population. We have the highest vaccination rate in the G7. We've passed a motion to ask the government to post a plan by February 28th so that we can return to normal life in Canada. Can the government commit to doing so? Honourable Member for Bellechasse, Les Etchemins-Lévis. Mr. Speaker, governing means making decisions. The lack of leadership has led to divisions within their own caucus even. We have to make efforts and sacrifices, but as it is time, like Dr. Tam has said, we have to reevaluate public health measures. Will the government decide to move forward, or will it continue to tread water with division and stigmatization?
Louvain.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Today at Ag Committee, the Canadian Pork Council stated that any inter-provincial trucking vaccine mandate would be very damaging to the industry and producers. Mr. Speaker, this proposal wasn't even considered at the height of the pandemic. Now Canadians are lining the streets in Ottawa, they're clogging major economic arteries, and they're getting pressure to the Prime Minister in every direction to ask when will we have a clear plan to move this country forward. I asked the Transport Minister, will he put on the record today that his government will not put forward an inter-provincial trucking mandate for the trucking sector?
That's a good question.
Minister. Member for Calgary Nose Hill.
Mr. Speaker, as the Minister of Public Safety correctly stated, it was the Windsor Police and law enforcement in Alberta that are diffusing the illegal public infrastructure blockades that have traumatized Canadians. In fact, it's not been the federal government. In fact, the Prime Minister has been inflammatory at best and unresponsive at worst as this crisis has mushroomed and traumatized Canadians. How can the Prime Minister justify asking for unprecedented power through the Emergencies Act when he's failed to exercise leadership with the authority that he already has? Mr. Speaker, as the Minister of Public Safety correctly stated, it was the Windsor Police and law enforcement in Alberta that are diffusing the illegal public infrastructure blockades that have traumatized Canadians. In fact, it's not been the federal government. In fact, the Prime Minister has been inflammatory at best and unresponsive at worst as this crisis has mushroomed and traumatized Canadians. How can the Prime Minister justify asking for unprecedented power through the Emergencies Act when he's failed to exercise leadership with the authority that he already has?
The Honourable Minister for Public Safety.
Once again, I want to thank the members of the RCMP who aided the situation in Windsor, and as a result now, we have an ambassador bridge that is reopened, which means that Canadians are going to get back to work and our economy is going to continue to roll on. But Mr. Speaker, I'm quite surprised to hear my honourable colleague asking about the inflammation of the situation outside this chamber when it was the interim leader who said, and I quote, "Don't go home. Let's make this a problem for the Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker." That is how you inflame the situation, and that's why it's important that the Conservatives call on the illegal blockades to end so that Canadians can get their lives back.
Member for Calgary Nose Hill.
That was embarrassing. Canadians aren't looking for finger pointing. They're looking asking for leadership right now. This is an unprecedented public crisis, but the federal government has done nothing. They have not responded to the provincial government's requests for resources to end this crisis. And now they are asking to invoke the Emergencies Act, which has never before been invoked in Canada, and several provinces have already said no.
Good.
It seems as though that they want to invoke the Act to get provincial governments to shoot it down as a way of abdicating use of their existing powers, which they have at their disposal. Why are they doing this instead of taking leadership?
For Avignon-la-Matisse Matapidia. Mr. Speaker, people hate a void. So in the face of a vacuum in federal leadership, people have stood up to potentially dangerous occupiers because they feel that their government has let them down. Citizens, as brave as they are, have put themselves at risk because of this government. Citizens, after 3 weeks of chaos, thought they could only rely on themselves. Mr. Speaker, protecting the public is the basis of the contract between people and their government. Does this government realize the impact of its leadership vacuum? We agree that there is a vacuum, then. People have reached this point because since the beginning of the crisis, the federal government has been 3 steps behind. It took 10 days to set up a tripartite agreement with all levels of government, but they forgot to bring people for make a spot for police, and it wasn't until day 16 that they finally created their own integrated command center. And today the government is talking about invoking the Emergencies Act, but they have no concrete plan to reveal. When will they take control of this crisis for real? For 18 days, the Prime Minister has allowed this crisis to escalate. Now he's announcing that he will invoke the Emergencies Act. But after 18 days, we've waited long enough for the federal government. The government must tell us today how it intends to use emergency measures. They need to give us a detailed plan, and they need to tell us exactly when they're going to put it into action. The public is running out of patience. Law enforcement is also. Mr. Speaker, what is the plan?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Blue Water Bridge border crossing and the 402 highway in my riding are still being impacted by the lack of action from the Prime Minister on these trucking mandates. Provinces are listening to their medical experts and they're getting rid of the mandates. When is the Prime Minister going to follow the science, listen to the World Health Organization, work with President Biden, and end these mandates?
Hear, hear.
Member for Prince Albert.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Provincial governments in Alberta and Saskatchewan have dropped the COVID-19 mandates. Both Manitoba and Ontario announced they will lift the vaccine passports March 1st. They, too, are following science. Will the government stop speculating and reassure truckers that they will not face new federal mandates when they cross provincial boundaries?
Tobic McDequack.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the foundational principles of leadership is that a leader should be slow to speak and quick to listen. We see a lot of talk from this Prime Minister, but not a lot of listening. Canadians are speaking clearly, and they want their lives back.
Yes.
When will the Prime Minister stop the division, stop the traumatizing, stop the name-calling and scapegoating, and instead start to listen to what Canadians are saying from coast to coast? Canadians are doing their part. When will the Prime Minister do his and end these divisive mandates?
The Honourable Governor for Winnipeg Centre.
Mr. Speaker, February 14th is the Women's Memorial March in honor of murdered and missing Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirited. Despite the national inquiry, the final report, the Liberals' weak national action plan, the violence continues. Last week, I attended the beginning of the inquest into the death of 16-year-old Aisha Hudson, killed by the Winnipeg City Police Service. Her family and thousands of others deserve justice. This government needs to immediately stop political soundbites and instead offer meaningful solution. Mr. Speaker, when will this government implement the calls for justice and stop the genocide?
For too long, families of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit women, girls, and 2 LGBTQIA members have suffered violence, injustice while consecutive Liberal and Conservative governments stood by. 6 years since the Liberals came to power, and things are only getting worse. In May 2020, Pauktutit Inuit Women's Association of Canada announced its concerns for delays in implementing the MMIWG calls for action. They called for a commitment of federal funding of $20 million. They are still waiting. We need to make sure that organizations who support girls and Indigenous girls and women can do.
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Commercial fishers on BC's coast are at their wits' end. They managed to get through 2 years of COVID impacts. And now, just when things look like they might be getting better, this government is causing more undue hardship by slashing the Pacific herring harvest rate. This decision was made with no scientific explanation, no consultation, no compensation, no concern for the livelihoods of fishers and including Indigenous operators. If the minister doesn't base her decision on science, what does she base it on?
Bay Central, Notre Dame.
Since 2015, 5,500 jobs have been lost in the Newfoundland and Labrador offshore oil and gas industry. The Bay du Nord project has been highly anticipated in my province for quite some time. This project represents a $12 billion investment in our offshore and $25 billion in revenues over the life of the project. After 1,285 days of endless red tape, can the Environment Minister tell us when will the Bay du Nord project be approved?
The Honourable Member for Coast of Bay Central, Notre Dame.
Right on. That's about what I was expecting. The government may be split over supporting this project, but the people of Newfoundland and Labrador are very united, with a weekend poll showing 85% support. After years of arduous environmental assessment, the Environmental Assessment Agency has given a green light to Bay du Nord. Will the minister respect the authority of the Environmental Assessment Agency and approve the Bay du Nord project? Yes or no?
Le député de Salaberry-sur-Roi.
Monsieur le Président, après...
Mr. Speaker, after 8 months of pressure, the government is finally admitting that it's heartless to cut the guaranteed income supplement for least wealthy seniors. As soon as the government admitted that it had made a mistake and that mistake plunged seniors into misery, the solution should have been implemented quickly. The Deputy Minister told us that a computer problem is preventing her from compensating victims of the mistake. Seniors cannot wait until May because of a computer bug. What will the minister do to speed up the compensation of senior citizens?
Oui.
Mr. Speaker, this mistake can't just be forgiven just because they admitted it. It's been 8 months that seniors have been making sacrifices. How can seniors endure months more of misery because of a computer problem? The government's proven that they can get the checkbook out quickly during the pandemic. When will seniors finally be able to do their groceries with dignity? What will the minister do to send that payment more quickly to the most vulnerable seniors?
9 months before Kabul fell, 23 Liberal MPs sent a letter to the Ministers of Immigration and Foreign Affairs warning them of the danger Afghan interpreters and those that serve Canada would face when the Taliban took over. They pleaded to help those families to immigrate to Canada with their families as soon as possible. Why did this government fall on deaf ears and ignore their own MPs and abandon thousands of Afghan interpreters and our allies, leaving them in harm's way?
For Calgary, Forest Lawn.
Speaker, they were busy knocking on doors, and there's no pride in only achieving 20% of that target, and the minister should be ashamed of himself for abandoning and also standing up for an election instead of helping those Afghans. The minister should be thanking the veterans, NGOs, and those in our NATO allies who actually stepped up when his government failed to. UNHCR testified that they had a plan to evacuate Afghan refugees back in January of 2021. This government knew about it and they ignored it. Why was an election plan more important than an evacuation plan?
Mr. Speaker, December 30th, 2020, 23 Liberal MPs sent a letter to the Minister of Foreign Affairs calling on him to provide safe passage to Canada for former Afghan mission staff. For his part, the Prime Minister pretended in September 2021 that he didn't have time, the situation was moving too fast, he didn't have time to prepare an evacuation plan. But the Prime Minister said he had no time to do anything in September when the letter was sent in December. Why is the Prime Minister not listening to his own MPs?
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hear regularly from Canadian charities working overseas about the damage direction and control regulations are causing. these silly regulations force charities to spend millions of dollars in unnecessary legal fees and obstruct genuine partnership by requiring donor control. So could the government tell us if they will finally listen to the sector and support our efforts to end outdated and neo-colonial direction and control regulations?
Mr. Speaker, for far too long, direction and control regulations have limited the collaboration between charities and other organizations. That's why I'm proud to sponsor Bill S-216 in this House. Bill S-216 would replace direction and control with an accountability framework that would allow for constructive and equal partnerships between charitable organizations and the communities they serve. It has already passed the Senate unanimously. Will this government commit to working with us to ensure this bill passes during the 44th Parliament?
Mr. Speaker, respectfully, that was a much worse answer than I was expecting. This is a question about direction and control. Again, to the minister, or some minister, we want an answer about direction and control regulations. Bill S-216 from my colleague has been before this Parliament and the Senate for years in the same form. Surely the government is aware of it. Surely the government has heard from someone in the development sector. So can we please get an answer to the question? Can we please get some good news instead of nonsense talking points on completely different issues? What is the government's position on reforming direction and control?
The Honourable for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ironically, 2 years ago today, the former leader of the official opposition said this, quote, "These protesters, these activists may have the luxury of spending days at a time on a blockade, but they need to check their privilege," unquote. It seems to me, Mr. Speaker, that we have a larger problem in this country of a double standard when it applies to how Indigenous protesters are treated by the police, how anti-Black racism protesters are treated. And I'd ask the honourable members and the minister if there is, in fact, a way to examine the double standard in policing and bring the implicit racism in the way we treat protests to an end.
I'm afraid that's all the time we have for question period today. C'est tout le temps que nous avons aujourd'hui.
That's all the time we have.
Comme il est 15h10, conformément à l'ordre adopté,
It being 3:10, pursuant to order made on Thursday, November 25th, 2021.
to the taking of the deferred recorded division